Welcome to Oh God, What Now? I'm Dorian Linsky. On today's show, Houthi rebels in Yemen are continuing strikes on cargo vessels in the Red Sea, ostensibly in response to the war in Gaza. As the UK and US hit back, we look at the justifications for action and the dangers of escalation. Plus, while Rishi Sunak rails against a fake war on motorists, public transport is in crisis across the country. How could Labour fix it? And in the extra bit for Patreon backers, in a world where so many dream holiday destinations are run by corrupt and bigoted governments, we attempt an ethical travel guide for the new year. But before all that, we have two big news stories to tuck into, so let's meet the panel straight away. Ros Taylor is the host of Jam Tomorrow and the author of The Future of Trust, out next month. Hello, Ros.
Hello, Dorian.
Zoë Grünewald is the brand new politics correspondent at The Independent. Hello and congratulations, Zoe.
Thank you, Dorian. I think I got a congratulations on the last podcast as well, so it's nice.
You're just constantly being congratulated.
Coming, yeah.
It's like people that say Happy New Year in the middle of February.
Yeah.
Our guest this week is Simon Calder, an award-winning travel journalist, author and broadcaster who is recognised as Britain's leading travel commentator. He once won Celebrity Mastermind with Concord as his specialist subject and currently writes for Zoe's new home, The Independent. Hello, Simon. Thanks for joining us.
Great pleasure to be here. Yeah, I've been here slightly longer than Zoe. I'm in my 30th year. Yes, I was very young when I started. Thank you.
OK, let's get started on two big news stories this week. The Commons vote on the third reading of the Rwanda bill a few hours after we record, which is annoying and inconsiderate. But we have some pre-match drama to discuss. Lee Anderson and Brendan Clark-Smith, the lovable deputy chairs of the Tory party, resigned on Tuesday after leading a 60-strong right-wing rebellion to vote for tougher amendments, which was backed by newspaper columnist Boris Johnson. Zoe. It says at least 29 rebels will be needed to defeat the bill, but probably because of the likely behaviour of other MPs, probably as many as 50. Does that seem plausible? And if not, does that make the gruesome twosome look foolish?
So I expect not. I think it will pass. Although just as I was walking into the studio, there was all sorts of wrangling on Twitter about Suella Braverman meeting, Robert Jenrick. But there is a thing in Westminster political reporters getting very, very excited about seeing two people meeting in Portcullis House and getting a bit carried away. So I suspect it will pass. But the question of whether it damages Sunak, I think it does. This is the only policy the government really have that they talk about over and over again, and to have such open division, warfare in their own party about something which they all broadly agree on, by the way, but the details of how to do it, it just shows a very divided government. And, if you can't even get your flagship policy through without debate or very public fighting, then I think it just shows that they really are out of ideas.
And being cynical for a moment, resignations like this are often about one's own political career, making certain statements, positioning yourself. What's up with these two?
It's a good question. I think Lee Anderson and Brendan Clark-Smith have been doing quite a bit of posturing for some time. Clearly, they don't really agree with the leadership of the party, but they're also very keen to be on the inside to kind of raise their profile. Now, they're probably both likely to lose their seats at the next election, or at least have some heavy damage there. But Lee Anderson's got his GB News slot. I think it's all about building their profile, maybe hoping for something, sometime in the future. Does the resignation make them look foolish? Does it bolster their position? I suspect it doesn't bolster their position in their constituency. Right. I think it maybe makes them a bit of a figurehead, but we've got so many figureheads on the right of the party now that it's quite a crowded market. So they've lost their positions in the party. They've raised their profile slightly. That's probably the extent of it.
So we've done the soap opera. Now let's do the policy. Damien Green, one of the few moderate Tories who actually says anything, said the rebels are betraying Tory values with authoritarian amendments. Now, those amendments were defeated by Labour. There were more amendments today. What did these ones consist of?
So the main thrust of the amendments, and there's sort of two groups of amendments. The first is from the right wing of the party, the rebels, who basically want to disapply the Human Rights Act. So it would mean that refugees, asylum seekers can't make human rights challenges, and neither can the courts. And basically strengthening the government's ability to send asylum seekers to Rwanda in spite of opposition about whether Rwanda's safe. And then the other side of it is the One Nation side, where they are very keen to see that we do adhere to our international obligations, and so do Rwanda. So they want to clarify that a safe country is a country that basically sits within those international obligations and the Human Rights Act. as I think you've gathered, these two things are really in opposition to each other. You can't have, we don't care about the human rights obligations we're under, and Rwanda and the UK must abide by them. So that's why we've got this real, we've got the party really at loggerheads here over what this means. And actually, this is really a battle for the future of the Conservative Party as well. Where do we sit in the world? You know, are we international leaders? Are we insular? Are we setting an example? You've got David Cameron back as Foreign Secretary. I mean, he very much comes from that one nation, world-leading perspective. But actually, Sunak is very much caught in the middle of the right-wing rebels and I guess what you would say used to be at least the heart of the Conservative Party.
Now it's off to America in a metaphorical concord, where the 2024 election has officially begun. Donald Trump swept the Iowa caucuses with 51% of the vote, trailed by Ron DeSantis on 21, Nikki Haley on 20, and stunt candidate Vivek Ramaswamy on 8. He then dropped out, having raised his profile and basically done the job. This confirms what we already knew. Unless lightning strikes, Donald Trump will be facing Joe Biden again in November. Now, Ros, it is on the face of it a decisive victory, but some commentators are arguing that Trump is effectively running as the Republican incumbent. He sort of thinks he's the incumbent president. So half the vote from a low turnout means that he's weaker than he looks. What do you think?
It's hard to read too much into the turnout. Chiefly because the weather in Iowa is bloody freezing.
It makes it feel quite summery here, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's lower than -20. So people who made it to the polls really, really wanted to go to the polls. Now, you know, that may work either way for Trump. It may be people who feel that it's very important that Trump doesn't become the next president, or people who feel very powerfully that he does. So it's difficult to judge too much from that. It's interesting because Iowa is obviously quite a conservative state, and it's always the first one to go, but it's not actually a very good guide to who gets the eventual Republican nomination. New Hampshire, which is, of course, the next one, is a much more reliable guide to who will actually pick it up. Nikki Haley has a great deal more appeal in New Hampshire than she had in Iowa, and it may well be that she does considerably better there than she has in Iowa, where she came in just third, because Ron DeSantis didn't do
But surely not well enough, though, because around 60% of registered Republicans believe that Trump actually won the 2020 election and that he should be president even if convicted of crimes.
Yeah.
That doesn't sort of speak well for Nikki Haley's chances.
Yeah, it's hard to be optimistic. But as I say, New Hampshire is a different proposition. It's got much more college-educated electorate, different. And if she does manage to pick up momentum, and if Trump literally or metaphorically stumbles, and it could still happen. The guy's not looking well. He appears to be limping. He's got some nasty red blotches on his hands, which no one seems quite able to explain. You know, he's now 77. It is quite possible that he could implode physically, never mind the legal problems that he's got. So that is probably what Nikki Haley will be hoping.
What I found remarkable was his victory speech, or at least the clip that was played in the radio, because apparently it went on for some time, where he made a call for national unity and bringing Republicans and Democrats together, which for people who follow his posts on Truth Social, where he's constantly promising to crush his enemies and destroy the Marxists who are undermining America, actually made me laugh out loud.
Yeah, I watched that speech. I watched it all the way through because I find Trump a very interesting speaker. I mean, repellent, obviously, but interesting. Because what he does, he always prefaces his worst stuff by saying something entirely reasonable. So in this one, he started out by saying, I don't want to be overly rough on Joe Biden. And then he goes on and says that Biden is the worst president that the US has ever had. And then he went into a long digression on Ukraine and how sad it was that Ukraine had been bombed and it was lamentable and so on. And then he went into something about how he was close to Putin. And I mean, the speech was not what you would call conciliatory. I mean, he also had a rant about how people from insane asylums were in countries that most people had never heard of were arriving in America. It was the usual. There were a couple of, as you say, conciliatory lines, but that was not the main content of what was going on.
If I might just chip in here, interesting from a travel point of view, of course, these wonderful locations for the primaries. Iowa is where Bill Bryson, the marvellous travel writer, comes from. And just to put it in context, he writes, outside Des Moines, the capital, there's a big sign that says, "Welcome to Des Moines. This is what death is like." And New Hampshire, actually, in contrast, is a very beautiful state. New England, of course, ideal in September, October when you've got the leaf fall. And even when you haven't, you've also got a large town called Concord, well worth visiting, and the White Mountain, I think, state or might be national park in the north. So, yes, you could do a tour of the primary states.
But not in January when the primaries are. That seems horrible.
Exactly, yes.
Ros, finally, in our planning meeting, we do actually plan these episodes. You were quite cross with Joe Biden over this.
Yeah, I'm
Why?
quite cross with Joe Biden. I think, we've got to the stage now when he's going to get the Democratic nomination unless there's a medical emergency or something like that. He thinks he's the only Democrat who can beat Trump. He's on a mission now, and he thinks that he's the only one who can do it. I think he's mistaken about that. But he's.
You think he can't beat Trump, or you think that there are other Democrats
I think
that could
there
have
are
done
other
it?
Democrats who are capable of beating Trump, but of course they have not been allowed to put themselves forward in any meaningful way because the party defers to Biden's authority, as is traditional with a sitting president.
Yeah.
And I get that, but he could have cultivated younger people. He's got a vice president who is even more unpopular than he is, and that is particularly important because of his age. And I just wish that, given the stakes are so very high this time, I mean, he might have fought in the past, so Trump won't, he'll implode or he won't get the Republican nomination. Now it looks like he will, and the stakes are so high, and his unpopularity is such that he should have stood aside, I think, for another candidate.
Well, here's my optimistic retort. A lot of people don't follow the news, and the argument has been made that actually a lot of people, they kind of didn't really sort of feel in their gut that Trump was going to be running again, that was a serious prospect. All the politics watchers knew that. But a lot of voters didn't. And the reason that the polls have been not so good for Biden, I'm not talking approval rating, but like head-to-head polls, is because people were sort of more venting their irritation with various things, whether that be policy on Israel and Gaza or whether it be the economy, which, as we discussed before, is actually doing quite well, but a lot of people don't believe that it is. And that now the election has really started, that it's actually going to galvanize a lot of people in their dislike of Donald Trump is going to outweigh their disappointment with Biden. And that the more we see of Trump, who, let's face it, hasn't even bothered to turning up to these debates because he didn't have to, the more his esoteric rhetorical style is on display, the more he says things like, "Congratulate me for overturning Roe v. Wade. I did that. That was a really good thing." The better it is for Biden. So that as we move through the year, the polls are likely to look rather better. I would like to believe that, but also I do actually believe that, not being complacent about it. But I do feel like that maybe this is the point at which Americans start seeing more of Trump and going, "Oh, that I didn't enjoy that."
I hope you're right. And I've been having very similar conversations, let's call them conversations, with my husband on this subject, who more or less shares your view much more closely. But I do worry a lot that they somehow, and I don't understand quite why, the good economic news is not sinking in the US, and particularly if inflation does hold up for longer than we expect or goes up again.
If I might just bring in another travel aspect here, I was at World Travel Market, this huge event in London, on the morning after the American presidential election, when the entire US delegation were just in shock. They couldn't believe it. They were sure that people would simply say, "Well, I'm not going anywhere near the US for the next 4 years." And of course, we all happily did, and were welcomed in by those friendly, smiling immigration people and a big picture of Donald Trump.
Yeah, I'm quite glad that the world of music journalism collapsed around that time, and so that I was no longer being sent regularly to America and didn't have to see his smiling face. Next up, Yemen's Houthi rebels continue to fire at international shipping lanes in the Red Sea in a campaign they began last year in apparent support of Gaza, although many of the targeted vessels have no connection to Israel. The UK and US have retaliated with strikes on Houthi missile bases. So far, casualties have been 0 to low on both sides. Yemen has been embroiled in civil war for the last 10 years, with the Shia Houthis, backed by Iran, rebelling against the internationally recognised Sunni government supported by Saudi Arabia. The conflict has killed over 300,000 people, although a ceasefire is held since April 2022, and Saudi Arabia is currently seeking a peace agreement between the factions. Ros, let us leave aside the people who have suddenly decided that the Houthis are noble freedom fighters campaigning for peace. How much do you think most people understand about the situation in Yemen, given that this has been, an enormously brutal and devastating civil war that's gone on for a decade?
Yeah, I mean, very little. I think we can all accept that, and I don't really blame them. I mean, it's an extremely complicated region with alliances between different powers that are constantly fluctuating.
It's a bit more complicated than the very simple version I just gave, isn't it?
Yeah, and it's obviously a lot more complicated than just Israel-Palestine, which is what we've been hearing about for the past few months, of course. There were people on the pro-Palestinian march in London on Saturday who were actually urging Yemen to attack Western ships, and that was, that's obviously a minority, and clearly those people don't know much about the civil war in Yemen, and they don't realise that the Houthis are not the same as Yemen.
Well, the slogan, some of them using the slogan "Yemen do us proud," and it's like, well, which Yemen?
Yeah,
that's the point of a civil war.
Because the Houthis do control some of Yemen, but not all of it. And I think the government didn't really roll the pitch enough before it joined in this US military action. Now, admittedly, our involvement in these airstrikes was relatively minimal, but we were the only country that joined the US in bombing the Houthis. It's an important decision. And, while you need an element of surprise for an attack, and I can understand why they wouldn't have set out their plans too much in advance, but when you're not going to debate it in Parliament, and you have a duty, I think, to explain the rationale and why you're doing that. And it all felt a bit post hoc. It all felt like, oh, we've bombed this, and this is why we did it, which is, I don't think, the way that it should be in a democracy where we have a chance to debate these things.
Well, Zoe, Lib Dems, SNP and Plaid Cymru were all arguing that, any kind of military intervention, not legally but conventionally requires parliamentary debate. As Ros said, the response is like, well, you didn't want to tell the Houthis you were about to do it. Do you think that that's a sort of valid reason? And was there a better way of handling it, even if you didn't want to lose the element of surprise?
Well, I think Ros is spot on, actually. I think absolutely it's the case that the decision to deploy armed force is a prerogative power. So that means it's exercised by the Prime Minister on behalf of the Crown, and you don't necessarily have to consult Parliament. And it is true that in the past, Prime Ministers have often consulted and informed Parliament prior to, almost as a matter of courtesy, and to ensure that the public are aware of what's going on as well. And also, there's a reason that MPs are there. They aren't just there to sanction things or say no to things. They're also there to offer alternatives, to consult with the government. They're there to be a moderating force in many ways. The government isn't under any constitutional obligation to do that. And I think Sunak and his spokesperson and the MOD have all set out a rationale for why they wouldn't have wanted to necessarily make that approach public. But I do think this was just almost like an entirely new bit of the sort of conflict in the Middle East that cropped up for many people. There was a story, I think, on the front page of the Telegraph. I might be wrong about that, but I'm pretty sure it was a Telegraph a couple of weeks ago that Grant Shapps had issued a warning to the Houthis saying, we will have to take military action if you continue to disrupt shipping in the Red Sea. But that was it. And it wasn't really talked about, and it just sort of very gently made its way up the news agenda. Then suddenly, oh, here we are, embroiled in another conflict. And I think that's quite alarming for people, for the public who are already concerned about military action in Gaza, who are concerned about, the escalation in Iran, Lebanon, all those kind of different elements of this conflict. And then to hear that we're taking action in this particular region as well, I think is quite concerning.
I suppose the weird thing about it is it's somewhere between, it's not quite a war. It's somewhere between like a war and a sort of almost like a police action, like a police raid. Like, as in, you wouldn't announce in advance that you're going to, like, raid a drug ring or whatever. And I suppose what they're doing here is it's targeted against pirates, but because of the whole political context, it's not entirely just like law enforcement.
Yeah.
It does feel a bit war-like.
It's another sort of proxy war or side of that kind of proxy war, isn't it? You're right. I mean, it's not direct sort of warfare. It's enforcement. It's defense. It's like an entirely different kind of thing. And you're right. It's action against piracy as well. So there's definitely a security angle to it, and there is I think a rationale for not bringing it up in Parliament. But I think the point about informing the public in some way or educating them about the conflict in the Middle East and exactly what it means by having our shipping routes disrupted is important too.
Right.
I would just like to point out what's happening geopolitically in terms of tourism as well, because there was an extraordinary response once we learnt that there were attacks by the US and the UK on Houthi positions in the Red Sea, or because of the Red Sea. Suddenly I got a whole lot of people contacting me on social media saying, I'm going to Egypt, I'm going to the Red Sea, can I cancel? Because frankly, I don't want to be caught up in this attack, and which is completely understandable. I mean, the wonderful Red Sea beaches of Hurghada, of Sharm el-Sheikh, of the whole Sinai Peninsula, fortunately are about 1,000 miles away, but it shows you just how people respond. And there has been a serious downturn in both Egypt and indeed in Jordan this year, mostly actually with Americans staying away. So the big tour groups who would normally be in January seeing the Nile, exploring Petra in Jordan and so on, they're simply not coming. Great time to go to these places. But of course, you've got to the north, the terrible Israel-Gaza crisis, and now the Red Sea getting lots of very bad press.
Well, a couple of years ago, you joined hordes of sunseekers and clubbers by visiting Yemen.
Yes.
But how was that?
Oh, it was spectacular until the point where we got airlifted out. But that was entirely because nothing to do with the Houthis, nothing to do with political struggles. This was entirely due to the pandemic. I should have learned, actually. So I was on the beautiful island of Socotra, which, I take it from me, 30 years from now will be one of those places in the Indian Ocean which people will pay an absolute fortune to stay in. Beautiful eco lodges. It is utterly charming, utterly beautiful, completely unspoilt on the grounds that it's very difficult and expensive to get to, especially if there's a pandemic on. So I've been into Saudi Arabia to test out the new tourist visas. My flight to Cairo got cancelled because of the pandemic. I thought, it's not really going to be a pandemic. I've seen all those scares before. So I got a bus to the Jordanian border. I paid a fixer $20 to get me across into Aqaba in Jordan. I then hitchhiked across Israel to the Egyptian border, and then finally got to Sharm el-Sheikh and flew up to Cairo and got my flight with an hour to spare. And then obviously got there, had a wonderful 5 days, and then suddenly they woke us up in our tents in the middle of the night and said, right, got to go to the airport now or you're going to be here for a number of months.
So who was in charge of the bit of Yemen that you were in then?
Well,
is that Houthi or the government?
No, but this island is kind of on its own and is the subject of a squabble, but a good squabble between various warring factions. So you've got, for instance, the UAE putting in loads of money. While hiking, I suffered an injury. I needed stitches. I got taken to a hospital where you would be so thrilled if you went to A&E and got the immediate, very good treatment like that. It was quite extraordinary, and that's because the UAE have pumped in loads of money, and Socotra is sort of seen as a place on its own. Certainly no threats or anything, just some wreckage of Soviet materiel from some godforsaken attack, or when they were using it as a proxy for something or other. But a very peaceful place. I strongly recommend you go there, but not during a pandemic.
Not, or indeed now. Ros, the Houthis, whose slogan, it's quite a long slogan, but includes the words "Death to Israel, a curse on the Jews," claim to be targeting ships of any nationality heading to the Zionist entity. But many other ships have been attacked. They were not on their way to Israel. And there's evidence that preparations for these attacks began weeks before October the 7th. So is there another motive?
Yeah, I mean, obviously it's been useful to ally themselves with the Palestinians because there's been a great deal of outrage in the Arab world at the bombing of Gaza and what it has done, and a sense too that Arab nations are not stepping up to defend fellow Muslims. So this is a useful way of distinguishing themselves as well and saying that we guys have got your back, even though of course they really haven't. And perhaps there's a sense too that the West uses the Red Sea as a convenient shipping route between China and the Far East and Europe, but it sees most of the people living in the region as expendable. I think there's probably that lying behind it as well. And no doubt the chaos in the Suez Canal when the Ever Given ship got stuck, you may remember, early in 2023 and nothing could pass for quite some time, might have given them some ideas for how to disrupt shipping. But it's also given them, the Houthis, just more clout, more power in their talks with Saudi Arabia. Which is really hoping to get shot of, as it were, of the Yemen war, and which the Houthis would love to take over the whole of Yemen, and for that to happen. So it's a strategic move, basically.
So we're used to humanitarian justifications for military action in the Middle East. Some, not time to get into it now, some haven't gone so well.
Yeah.
This is explicitly about protecting trade,
Yeah.
which some people interpret as a rather sort of grubby reason. But what are the consequences of disrupting Red Sea shipping, like for ordinary people?
I mean, they're pretty massive. They just haven't really shown up yet because the extra costs that it entails take a while to filter through. So if you divert shipping, the only place you can divert shipping to avoid this narrow strait that the Houthis are attacking ships in is via South Africa, right, around there, which adds a huge amount of extra distance. It uses up an extra $1 million in fuel costs for every journey that one of these massive super tankers take. And also the insurance costs go up as well. Not just if the trip is longer, but if you are going through the strait, the insurance costs are rocketing because of the risk that your ship will be attacked. You have to pay the crew more because no one's going to want to be on a ship that might well be attacked or taken over by pirates. And so you've got to up their wages, and all this is going to is already increasing the cost of shipping goods like this, and that is inevitably going to be passed on. And quite a lot of the stuff that's shipped is oil and gas as well, and of course that's something to which Western countries are particularly sensitive.
So far, the Houthis haven't yet sunk a ship or killed any crew members. The US, UK have targeted weapons, not civilians. Everybody is saying we're not looking for regional conflict. This is a very limited thing to protect, the rule of law and freedom of navigation and so on. It might escalate. Zoe, how is new Foreign Secretary David Cameron handling himself on this?
I think he's handling himself rather well in terms of optics. I think when Cameron came back, people thought the adults are back in the room, and that maybe isn't so much a praise of David Cameron, more a testimony to what the Conservative government have been like over the past few years. But he does have this statesman-like quality to him, which I think is very helpful for the role of Foreign Secretary, because this is the person you're going to be putting out most in front of diplomats, in front of some of our sort of fiercest allies, and some of the people we perhaps don't have the greatest relationship with. So, and obviously he's a very experienced statesman. He was Prime Minister. So in terms of all that, I think he's doing rather well.
Well, I did flinch when you said that Grant Shapps had sent a warning to the Houthis. And I was like, I can probably see why they didn't back down,
Absolutely, yeah. But yeah, I think David Cameron does do rather well. One of the problems, obviously, is that he is mainly accountable in the House of Lords. So he did he answered some questions in the House of Lords just yesterday. And that doesn't get very much pickup in the same way as if he was in the House of Commons answering those questions. So that's a bit frustrating in terms of the public and MPs being able to scrutinise what he's doing. He was obviously on the airwaves on Sunday speaking to Laura Kuenssberg. I think more attention was paid to his lobbying involvement rather than his kind of diplomacy. But I think he takes the line that everyone would expect him to take on conflict in the Middle East. He did say he was concerned about whether Israel had abided by international law, but still kind of backed the party line on that. I mean, you'd expect him to take an approach that's very similar to the US and to just abide by that. And I think that's what he's doing. Is the military action that we're taking in the Middle East going to help? I mean, I think ultimately this looks like it's just escalating further and further every day. You know, when you've got the Houthis, who are obviously backed by Iran, being, you know, sort of taking this provocative action in the Red Sea, you do worry about what's going to happen and how things are going to, you know, worsen. So I think David Cameron does as much as he can do in terms of being a very competent kind of statesman, but whether the UK is actually going to do anything consequential in this space, I think is a different question.
I did kind of relate when I saw a quote from Cameron, I can't remember in which context, where he just went, this is a really like dangerous time and all the red lights are flashing on the dashboard and it's awful. And I don't know whether this is him just going, actually my job is very hard. But I thought, no, he's not wrong.
Yeah, it makes you relieved that Boris Johnson is not currently Foreign Secretary. It's looking back, that was one of Theresa May's more bizarre decisions, wasn't it?
You don't want someone trying to banter the Houthis into submission.
It's also not just what's going on right now, it's what other countries are going to look at the sort of mess in the Middle East and look at our involvement in Ukraine and think, now might be quite a good time to kind of be a bit provocative. And of course, China and Taiwan is always flashing on red on the government's dashboard in the background. And there are concerns, obviously, that could escalate over the next 5 years. And I think Grant Shapps, sorry to bring him back up, made a speech earlier in the week about, you know, there are plenty of other fronts of conflict that could be fought across the world and we need to be prepared for them. So, I'm not sure David Cameron is getting all 8 hours of sleep at night, but...
He's enjoying himself.
Yeah.
Next this week, if you're listening to this on a train and you're actually going to arrive at your destination on time, you are statistically among the lucky ones. In the first half of last year, 44% of all rail services in Britain were delayed or cancelled. Last year, the network was hit by strikes, a fare increase well above inflation, the news that Rishi Sunak was cancelling the remainder of HS2, but good news, spending some of the money on roads in London. How messed up is the UK's transport system and what could a Labour government do about it? Simon Calder is our expert. I actually can't remember a time without delays, cancellations and fare hikes on the railways and travel chaos headlines. Is there a systemic problem here that can't be pinned on one government or policy? Or does it all sort of stem from one particularly bad decision?
Look, the offence of government after government, and I'm most certainly including the Blair-Brown governments in this, has been negligence. They have actually, over the past 25 years or so, presided, until COVID, presided over a rapidly growing rail system in terms of passenger numbers. Now, how much of that is simply because it's so awful on the roads? How much is naturally a product of gradual economic growth? It's difficult to tell. But things have happened despite governments. Now we are in an entirely different situation where everything is simply decided, it seems, by number 10 on the grounds of what is most politically expedient for us. And that means cancelling outrageously the Manchester leg of HS2, but also it means this absolutely miserable situation for any rail passenger, including me. I don't have a car. There's 20 million British people who don't have access to a car, where you can't plan anything more than 2 weeks ahead because we're now in the third calendar year of strikes, which is something in my many, many decades of covering this industry we have never seen before. And that's basically because actually the train drivers union are perfectly happy to carry on striking. They've got more 9 days of industrial action designed to cause maximum disruption, of course, as any union would do, with minimum loss of pay. That's coming up from the 29th of January going through to the 6th of February. In order to just remind everybody that they are there and their demands have not gone away. And speaking to Mick Whelan, the General Secretary of ASLEF, he says, we're just waiting for a change of government, but we're just kind of prodding away, making sure people know we're here. And that is just one tiny part of the misery of the rail system, there is a lack of infrastructure. So that, for example, on the day we're speaking today on a very cold day, so I thought I'd see what the damage was caused by that. And in Scotland, of course, you've got Perth to Inverness, that's all suspended. But then you just see, oh, okay, there's a broken third rail at Vauxhall. We've got a points failure somewhere else. We've got signal failures on Great Western, all manner of problems which are absolutely relentless. They seem to be increasing. And furthermore, on top of that, you've got staff shortage, which the unions will say, this is outrageous. It's entirely down to the money-making train operators for failing to train enough people. But in fact, it's all just part of the national misery and a reflection of absolutely toxic industrial relations. I've never known it so bad, and I'm honestly an optimist because travel is supposed to be the industry of human happiness.
Well, you've called Sunak the most anti-rail prime minister ever. Is that predominantly because of a HS2 decision, or do you just sense it generally? I don't know whether he gets on the train much.
Oh, no, he doesn't. I mean, he's got total disdain for trains. There was a photo opportunity in a pharmacy in Southampton. Now, he would need to go across the river from Downing Street. That would take 5 minutes to Waterloo. It would take an hour and 15 minutes to Southampton. But how much more convenient it is to get a helicopter to Southampton. And obviously, this is a tradition which Liz Truss, I think, got absolutely to perfection when she decided that, no, she wasn't going to fly on Qantas, which had perfectly good scheduled flights to do exactly her itinerary in Australia. She was going to fly an Airbus A321 which normally has 235 seats on. She was going to fly it with a handful of advisors to and around Australia and back. It cost us £500,000, but hey, why not? There is simply no appetite for rail, which is why we are now going into or indeed quite a way along a spiral of decline, which means that you cut back on services because, well, frankly, rail revenue is so terrible, and so fewer people travel by train. They haven't got any certainty, any resilience, and so it is absolutely miserable.
I think that's a very good analysis. I mean, I think one of the things that people love to say about Sunak is that he's out of touch, and a really easy thing he could do, because it's something that's levied against him all the time, and I actually think it really cuts through as a criticism. One of the simplest things he could do is stop using that private jet, but he just seems to be the helicopter and the private jet, but he just seems to be addicted to it. And I think you're right. The only possible explanation is that he's just incredibly anti-rail. He feels it's inefficient, it doesn't work for him, which is so out of touch with how most people have to operate.
I saw a photo of him on a bus once, though, talking to an old lady. So I know that he stepped on a bus.
Yeah, but
yes,
I remember that photo. Yeah. Yes, where he seems to be shouting at her. Simon, I'm interested to know what you know about Labour's transport policy so far, because
I was interested to know what you knew. Frankly,
I mean, we do know that they have refused to say whether they'd reinstate HS2, and basically it sounds like a no because there's not enough money, basically, which seems to be behind a lot of Labour's lack of policy at the minute. Do you know anything more?
Well, it all depends who you listen to. So we've got the Louise Haigh, who's the Shadow Transport Secretary. We have Stephen Morgan, the Shadow Rail Minister. And we've got various other people who are saying things such as, yes, we are going to reinstate HS2 in full, including the bit to Leeds, and we're going to build Northern Powerhouse Rail in full, and then they get slightly shut down. Not to extend HS2 at least to Crewe would be almost as much of an act of criminal damage as Sunak has already done, because actually the benefit cost analysis for that stretch of railway, taking the strain off the West Coast Main Line and properly connecting the Midlands with the Northwest, was actually the main benefit. And actually you also need the line up to Leeds in order to make the whole thing coherent. At the moment, we will have, maybe in 10 years, a shuttle that runs between this very, very bleak Old Oak Commons station in West London and Curzon Street in Birmingham. And as you will have read, under the current plans, there would be fewer seats to and from Manchester, and the journey would take longer than it does at the moment. But this is all
apart from that,
and that is simply Sunak suddenly deciding, okay, there's electorally we need to get the motorists on side, and quite right in terms of numbers, an awful lot more people drive than take trains regularly. But in terms of Labour's policy, I mean, it's one of these many things where it's much easier to be heckling Andy Burnham, a brilliant operator in terms of every time there's a crisis, he will score political points from it very effectively. And it's, as with education, as with the NHS, it's actually much easier being in opposition than having to sort things out. So what do we know? Well, they are going to, and we've got a very recent tweet from Stephen Morgan, the rail minister, saying that, yes, they are going to bring all the train operators into public ownership as contracts expire, which could actually take a decade or so. But it's as though, and this is the rhetoric of the unions as well, ASLEF and the RMT, they say, well, if only you didn't give billions of pounds to all these private companies, everything would be fine. Slightly ignoring the fact that more and more of the railway is in public ownership. So LNER, Southeastern, TransPennine Express, Northern, and it's your call about how whether being in public ownership has helped. The train companies which are privately owned, effectively everything they do is stipulated by the Department for Transport, and they get a 2% fee for it. So that's effectively outsourcing, and it's not going to make much difference at all. It is simply a good something which polls well, saying you're going to renationalise the railway. The railways are renationalised. So rail is going to be a huge problem that won't be easily solved, although I think the unions will, particularly ASLEF, will find a solution. But I mean, that would mean us having to wait another 10, perhaps, months before of just one strike a month, just to remind you that we can do this and add to the general misery. Buses. This is the big thing. We're going to take back control of the buses and give it to you, local areas. Buses are a huge problem. More people catch buses than any other form of public transport. And Labour says, yes, they've been absolutely is the case. Since 2010, the number of miles has reduced by 300 million by buses, and everyone's getting their services cut. But again, it's kind of, yes, everything's going to be fine. We're not going to tell you yet how that's going to be fine. There is no visionary strategy. There is no innovation going on. There's no recognition that actually, if you're in a rural area where loads of people have cars because the buses are so terrible, and the more people who have cars, the worse the buses get, then you've got to think of something else. And they're very good at doing this in rural France. So, for example, they have organised hitchhiking. So I don't know if anybody else here hitchhikes. I do occasionally and find it generally very good. But I can understand a lot of people, particularly women, wouldn't want to hitchhike. So you have an app-based system in rural parts of France where, because you know that 5 cars a minute are going to be leaving this small French village to drive into the nearest town. So you just have an app which says, yeah, I'm a recognised hitchhiker, you're a recognised driver, stand here beneath this sign, and we don't have to have run buses. It works really well, and that's the sort of thing which you can actually do on a local basis, improve transport at very low cost to the exchequer. But Labour seems a very long way away from that.
So can I ask you a question where I'm in danger of using the phrases red wall and levelling up?
We need a klaxon, don't we?
Yeah, the little big swear jar. But bus services outside the big cities, not just rural areas but towns, have been a problem for years. And they seem to become quite totemic politically. That a lot of when people are just talking about, what life is like outside the big cities, and they're always talking about sort of buses. Is that something that, but Andy Burnham loves his buses, is that something that Labour would be politically wise to do something about? Because that does seem to be the sort of thing that affects a lot of people's lives on a daily basis.
I think buses fit quite nicely and almost symbolically into Labour's vision, which is not only levelling up, although I think levelling up as we know it might evolve into something else that kind of is about devolution and communities and social mobility. But I think it fits quite nicely in rebuilding communities that have been left behind, re-energising them, injecting them with investment and business and making them become their own hubs. And that's where buses are really key, because buses are very localised, aren't they? That you get from one little village into a town or whatever, they're much more kind of localised. And I think it would be a really symbolic thing for Labour to look at fixing the broken bus services and giving back control to local authorities about bus services in their community, because buses are not only a really key part of transport, which I think is often neglected by the kind of motorists and in London and the big cities, but also they're actually key to tackling loneliness, social exclusion. For a lot of people, getting on the bus is part of their day. Your local people used to know their local bus driver, and all that's kind of changed. It's also very good for the environment, obviously, to catch a bus. So it could be a really big part of their levelling up agenda. And I think it would be quite symbolic to show that Labour isn't just a Westminster government anymore. They care about the rest of the country, and they care about the needs of the rest of the country.
I have a particular bee in my bonnet about Eurostar at the moment. So I like Eurostar. I want to use Eurostar, but every time I think about using Eurostar and I go to the site and try to search for a fare, I find that it is twice the price of flying, sometimes up to 4 or 5 times that. Now, I understand that there are issues around capacity now, post-Brexit, and they can't get enough people through the gates fast enough. But it just seems tragic that something has become, frankly, something that is only available to the rich.
This is monopoly pricing. Of course it is. The vast majority of people who need to travel between London and Paris and London and Brussels, and a smaller proportion to Amsterdam, will go on Eurostar because, frankly, it's mad going to Heathrow and then flying from there and all of that. And Eurostar was absolutely trashed during COVID, more than I think almost any other travel company, which is saying quite a lot. But what everybody needs is competition. Yes, there were huge problems that arose from Brexit, and my goodness, the amount of damage that Brexit did to travel. Part, of course, the democratic vote to leave, but then the way that we were negotiated, the way that the government suddenly said, we're going to stop people coming in with identity cards. Hooray! That will be 300 million EU citizens who can't come here, without realising that actually inbound tourism is about as close as you can get to free money. It's an absolutely miraculous thing, which means that you've got jobs created, you've got amenities paid for, and it's brilliant. But we said put up the big keep out signs, and indeed devastated the economy of places like
listeners.
Hastings.
We've covered Brexit in previous episodes.
Yes, sorry.
If you want to go back and see where we are.
Anyway,
this is red meat. This is people. They love this.
Okay, so therefore, you have this ludicrous situation because the government was so keen for us to become third country nationals that we have got to have our passports stamped at St Pancras, and there isn't room. Don't get me started on the entry-exit system. Perhaps we can talk about that another time. But that is going to devastate East Kent, where even the Conservative Council is predicting months of Operation Brock and traffic jams. So, leaving all that aside, the successive governments haven't realised that there is one part of transport in Britain which is phenomenally successful, which works without any government interference, and that is aviation. We have absolutely the best, the safest, the highest value, the lowest cost aviation industry in the world, and we've got that just by allowing competition. And that's why I certainly wouldn't tonight go from here to St Pancras and catch a train to Paris at short notice, because I know I'd be paying £200. I'd head to whichever airport has the cheapest fare, probably Luton tonight, and I'd pay half as much, and it would be ridiculous, and I'd get to Charles de Gaulle and I'd have to run around and everything else, but I'm going to do that to save £100. So competition is what is actually going to save everything. And that's quite a problem for Labour because, of course, you've got all this, we're taking this back from the private sector, as opposed to, let's have a look at what the private sector's done in aviation. Isn't this brilliant? Let's encourage new arrivals. Let's see if we can set up something which isn't quite Eurostar, but maybe it goes from Ebbsfleet, this place by the M25 in North Kent. Let's see if we can have a sort of stopping service which is going to take us to Paris, and it'll be the budget, it'll be the Ryanair alternative. So that's what we need. We will get there sooner or later, but at the moment, I absolutely agree with you. Eurostar is doing what any sensible monopolistic provider would do, which is just extracting as much cash as it can.
So to turn to the roads, after the Uxbridge by-election, also see previous episodes, Sunak tried to make the so-called war on motorists a thing. Now, obviously, air pollution, climate change are reasons to reduce the number of car journeys. What is the most effective way of doing that? Like how, if you were, I'm pointing you Labour's transport style here, prematurely, as I'm sure they will. If you've got that idea of like, look, you want to get more people off the road and you want to get them onto public transport, and for all these reasons, but you don't, how do you do that? Perhaps in a most politically cunning way.
Well, I don't think there's any room for cunning. It's very simple, simply tax. And the fuel price escalator, which has been removed effectively for years and years and years, you need to tax people off the roads.
So you do need a war on motorists.
Well, you do, because you then can funnel, particularly if you ring fence that cash, you can put it into public transport. And by the way, you've got to be really thoughtful about public transport. Zoe was talking about how important the buses are. Yes, they are, but all too often, and I don't know how often you are in various parts of the UK on a bus, all too often I'm the only passenger on it. But that is perhaps a reflection of the fact that people have lost all faith in the resilience of buses as well.
So there is that vicious circle, isn't it, of the sort of bad service, fewer people use it, service gets worse, there's less justification for putting money into it.
Yeah.
And fewer people take it because you can't depend on it anymore. So, if you've got to wait 3 hours for a bus, you're not going to take it, right? I wonder if they will keep the £2 bus fare, which has been really good. Do you think Labour will keep that?
Well, it's going up to £2.50 very soon, I think. But the thing is, that is actually a distortion, which means that, for instance, if you're going from Leeds to Scarborough, you could go on a taxpayer subsidised Transpennine Express train and pay £13, or you could, if you've got another hour to spend, just catch the £2 bus. And I'm not sure that moving people away from one state subsidised form of transport, which is actually quite efficient in getting you there quite timely, to another, which is sorry to say, this smelly old diesel bus, is necessarily a good thing. And it is also one of these things where actually people, I don't think, are averse to paying a reasonable fare if they think they're getting a good quality, reliable service. And you can keep, it's not a very particularly expensive thing to keep subsidising, so you could keep doing it. But I think there are many more important things to do with the money.
So to wrap up, what is the thing that you think that is obvious for people, in your line of work who are following, problems with the transport system that Labour are not talking about yet, that might not be vastly expensive and just seems like an easy win?
Well, you first of all get on and bring back British Rail, which is at the current time called Great British Railways. The Tories have sort of had a look, they're very half-heartedly doing that. But you remove it from Westminster. You just say, let's get Whitehall, in fact, Department of Transport, let's just get people who know the railways to run the railways. And we are going to be absolutely merciless at cracking down on costs, because yes, the railway is losing billions of pounds. The subsidy has rocketed since COVID and the collapse of rail revenues. But unless you get a handle on costs, then you are just going to be in this spiral of decline, and things are going to get much worse. So railways is the biggest subject, and something which they could do on day one, which is just say, we're not going to have civil servants telling Transpennine Express how many trains they've got to run and what sort of tea they've got to serve. We're just going to let that go to an organisation which is going to be a kind of virtuous 21st century version of British Rail, if anybody remembers that.
I do, because
So do I. It's okay, Tory.
So Zoe probably doesn't.
Oh, and then but you also allow competition to thrive, and you bring in competition on as we've seen on the East Coast Main Line particularly, which actually delivers great value and gets more people travelling by train because the rail companies have to compete. So therefore, people who are thinking of driving or flying are now catching trains because, well, they're cheap as chips.
So that's the end of the show. Thanks to Ros,
Thank you.
Zoe,
Thank you.
and Simon.
Thank you very much for having me. It's such a thrill actually to meet you all.
Bless you. Thanks for coming in. Stay tuned for the extra bit after Demon is a Monster by Corner Shop and the traditional thank you to our supporters. You could join them and get the podcast early and without ads, plus lots more. Search Oh God What Now Patreon. And just want to say thank you to Alex Rees, who has been a producer and co-script writer on Oh God What Now and Romaniacs for more than 4 years, and he is off to pastures new. I will miss him. Thank you, Alex.